I can safely say that this is the largest audience that we've ever had for one of my students that work for the Census. And so what I'll do is I'll say a little bit about the process and then give a brief introduction to Hailey. And then she will give her presentation. There'll be some time for questions and answers from the audience. And then the public part of the defense will come to a close, and we'll excuse all of you wonderful supporters and listeners, and then we'll proceed with the close part of the defense with just the committee that will go on. So, that's how the process works for those who haven't attended a defense before. I'd like to introduce Hailey's committee members are Dr. Pete Taylor, Theology, Dr. Paul Myman, both in Rangeland Stewardship, and Dr. Justin Werner. In addition, when you have a student who does a really interdisciplinary kind of project, it really takes a village, shall we say. So there's a couple of other people I particularly recognize who have been really important mentors to Hailey in this process. And one of them is Dr. David Augustine and also Mr. Andy Lawrence and John Lawrence as well. And of course, there are many other members here from the Dr. Grazing Management project that you'll hear about, Hailey's family, friends, and so all of you. But I especially wanted to call out because Hailey hails from Livingston, Montana. She received her a double major bachelor's from Cornell University in International Agriculture and Rural Development, also agriculture science education. She taught ag science at the high school level and then also worked in victim services in Colorado before coming to CSU to pursue her master's here at Rangeland, and moved into her PhD program. And unbeknownst to her, when she started, went on to an accelerated track where she wasn't really planning for her to finish for about another some great opportunities, so the offers she couldn't refuse, went on to the fast track and did 18 months of work in about 6 months. So, and with that, I will turn it over to Hailey. I will make one comment that this is also being filmed and live. I don't know if you call it stream, but live broadcast to some of the folks, some of the other Rangeland partners and other collaborators. So just be aware when we come to the question and answer session that the questions.
Okay, great. Thanks, Maria. Start my timer so I don't go over too much. And I also want to thank Lauren Prince, who's here. She's also on my unofficial committee of ARS researchers and interdisciplinary researcher herself. And Craig Lawrence in the back is going to answer questions after I finish. So. All right. And also, Pam Freeman isn't here today, but Pam was the lead biological technician on this project, so all the ecological data that you see is really a result of Pam's hard work. She's at a wedding, I think, so I hope she's having more fun. Probably not as good cake, though. So most of you are familiar with this idea of rangeland systems, and I want to kind of give a brief overview of where I'm going to be talking about because place is important. And the estimates always vary between a third and half of the globe is being covered in rangelands. And in the 14 Great Plains states, about 45% of our surface area is grassland. And that includes the northern mixed prairie and shortgrass steppe of Colorado and Wyoming, where I'm going to focus the discussion today. The Society for Range Management, of course, defines rangelands as lands in which the indigenous vegetation is predominantly grasses, grass-like plants, forbs, and shrubs, and is managed as a natural ecosystem. And we know that in this region, extensive beef operations are managed under high levels of weather variability, and also a lot of change in rural America that we've been experiencing since World War II. Weather variability. So we know that rangelands are actually as much about the people that manage them as they are about the plants and the animals that live there. And most of us, there's something 6.4 billion people on Earth. About 5% of us live on rangelands. But 1 billion people derive their livelihoods directly from rangelands, and another 1 billion people, is estimated, rely on rangelands for resources like animal protein, clean water, and places to practice our cultural, spiritual, and recreational activities. Getting a little closer to home, if you drove east of here about 45 minutes or so, or sometimes it takes an hour and a half, you'll find yourself in the Central Plains Experimental Range, where research is literally built from the equipment and the boards and the barbed wire that was left behind by folks that were bought out by the federal government after the Dust Bowl. And where grazing research has worked to, first it was really focused on improving production on rangelands. And recently it's understanding how we can best manage rangeland ecosystems to support diverse animal communities, but also support cattle production at the same time. Getting all feedback, stuff over here. Over that time period, in 1738, and all that we've learned about making science-based recommendations for grazing managers, there's been one thing, and that's been human decision-making processes. We have done a lot of grazing experiments, but we're really lacking in understanding about how grazing decision-making processes work on the ground in real life. And we've also recognized that the ecological outcomes of grazing management decision-making sometimes take decades or longer to manifest in the ecosystem. And there are very few experiments like this that have been running long enough for us to start to see those outcomes. So it's increasingly important that we think of new ways to link science and managers together to answer some of these questions that we can't do on the experimental range. So humans have been missing from our grazing management experiments. And that's something that biophysical scientists all over are recognizing. And Ellison Ramankutty did a empirical analysis of where humans live, how they use the land on the terrestrial surface of the Earth. And they determined that 75% of the Earth's surface is human systems punctuated by some natural systems. So we teach biospheres and we teach about the Earth's surface as biosystems with human disturbance. We actually look at how humans are using the Earth. So we have to think about this inextricable link between humans and natural systems and incorporate humans into our research in a meaningful way. Managers are also recognizing that gap between scientific recommendations and their experiences. And I put up a quote at the beginning, which was quite long, from a rancher that I've been working with since 2012, who responded to a conference he went to where he didn't feel like managers had been included. He said, we have boots on the ground 24/7. We might be managing postage stamps, but we're managing them for multiple species. It's important to incorporate manager perspectives when we think about policy and research. So today I'm going to look at this gap between rangeland management as it's defined in our experimental context and how management and learning work on the ground for real managers. And I'll do this in 3 ways. First, I'm going to look at the scale of ranchers themselves and ask, what is rangeland decision-making like for individual ranchers? And I'll do that with repeated interviews that I conducted with 6 folks that I sub-selected from a larger study. Then I'll look at the ranch as a social ecological system. So I'll add to those interviews some ecological monitoring that we did on 17 ranches in Wyoming and Colorado. And get a better idea of the outcomes for both the social system and the linked ecological system. And then the fun part of the presentation is this discussion of a group of collaborative stakeholders who are working with us at the Central Plains Experimental Range on a participatory research project. And the research question there is, can participatory research facilitate social learning among diverse rangeland stakeholders for multiple goals and objectives? Okay, let's start out with the ranchers in the room. We know a lot about ranch decision making from broad scale surveys that have helped us understand the predictors of adoption of innovations and conservation practices. Kind of that list of what we think ranchers should be doing has changed over the years as our goals have changed in the public lands management context. When you're in Maria's lab, it's hard to avoid this concept of adaptive management. This is a pretty common theoretical framework that's taught in natural resource management. And really over the course of my lifetime, it's been presented as an alternative to command and control management. The adaptive management cycle takes planning, monitoring, evaluation, and adaptation into natural resource management in an attempt to deal with natural systems as coupled social ecological systems where we have to learn to adapt to complexity rather than try to iron it out or control it. So this has been kind of a driving paradigm for natural resource management and linking ecosystems with human systems and understanding that we need to adapt and learn. And it's been framed by Holling and Meff and others as a formal scientific process. So we would use the formal scientific method to do this adaptive management approach. So there's kind of these boxes that emerge in natural resource management, thinking about command and control as one paradigm, adaptive management as another paradigm. But at the same time in the social sciences, folks have been dealing with this question of sort of how do humans fit into nature? What's their relationship with nature? And so I'll put up this, it's called The Great Divides. Latour presents two great divides. The first is the division between nature and society and suggests that modernist societies like to separate themselves from nature because that gets us away from the constraints of nature with technology, innovation, grazing systems. And the second great divide is an external great divide that separates us from them, us from those people who aren't like us, especially those people who are having a hard time seeing this as a real. And social scientists have dealt with this in a lot of different ways. Feminists deal with it as this artificial divide between humans and nature, between men and women, between rationality and emotion when it comes to knowledge. And post-colonial scholars have dealt with it in terms of how we put other people in boxes and say, they're not like us, so we don't necessarily have to deal with them on the same level. So at the same time, there's been discussion in these two realms of science, adaptive management and also the social sciences that deal with how humans relate to nature. But I thought it might be a good idea to ask people that have to do it every day. And so I selected a subset of 6 family ranches on the Shortgrass Steppe in northern Mixed Prairie, with whom I had existing relationships. And it's a smaller group than my larger study because I had actually done the interviews with folks in 2012. And I wanted to ask them how they relate to nature. How do they deal with the weather? What does it look like behind the years of wars? So we conducted those interviews in 2012, 14, 15, and 16, transcribed the interviews and looked for patterns between the data to get at not just ranchers' relationships with nature, but their specific actions that they described taking, and then how they related to those outcomes. And I used a free software in R called RQDA, and I also used Excel. And then I went back to the ranchers and asked them if they thought this made sense to them. And one rancher sat down with me for many hours and helped me synthesize these findings on his own ranch, which really helped a lot. And we presented that at the Grasslands Conference. So the points here that I want to make. One is that these boxes of adaptive management or command and control don't really apply to these ranchers. And when they're trying to make tough decisions when it comes to drought, maybe they have too many cattle and they either need to sell cattle or buy hay, that tough decision kind of puts them between a rock and a hard place. And one rancher said to me, sometimes there's no good answer and sometimes it's halfway in between. So maybe these ideas of adaptive management and control that we have in the literature don't really apply to ranchers at the scale that we're working with. When did ranchers talk about controlling? They talked about controlling a lot when they talked about grazing. We needed to use grazing management strategies not just for vegetation management, but also for labor constraints and to deal with complex topography. Prairie dogs and elk are another story. won't get into that. But they also talked about adaptation, and I want to provide an alternative framework that engages with different social science theories that can give us some understanding of how they adapt and learn. This is a theoretical framework I'm calling the rancher's ethic of care, and it implies that ranchers are constantly trying to reduce the vulnerability of ranch systems in terms of cultural, ecological, and economic components through specific actions of care. And we created a taxonomy of things that ranchers describe doing to take care of the range condition, take care of wildlife, and to take care of livestock well-being. They use long-term thinking, and by that I mean multi-generational scales of planning, and they emphasize learning and respect. The word respect doesn't pop up a lot in the adaptive management literature, but if you're a kayaker, you might recognize, the need to respect the leader. Very powerful, and so respecting her is part of learning. Ethic of care is actually well described in the feminist literature and also in healthcare, where it's described as a relational ethic. So rather than coming into a situation and acting based on justice, knowing what's right and what's wrong, relational care ethic describes acting based on what's going on in that context now and being responsive to the needs of the environment at this point in time. And the emphasis is on caring for things. So just to give you an idea of what this looks like for a rancher, one said to me, I ask myself, do I want to spend time and money on a tree that I will never see? It won't save a calf in a storm in my lifetime. I've been planting trees up here in the meadow for 20 years, and there are a few to show for it. I thought I could stick cows in here in a storm and they would be protected, but it's not coming true very fast. There's something to good stewardship that just says you save it for future generations. When I sent out my invites to my defense, I sent one to Jack Alexander, who's a consultant up in Montana, and he said, I want you to talk a little bit about this concept of adaptive management. Why do we even have to say adaptive? Isn't it just management? For ranchers, isn't it just management? And this chapter kind of deals with that in some ways, and I wanted to put parentheses around it, but Maria thought it was a little excessive. But ranch management is adaptive management, and I'll talk a little bit more about what this means. But I think if we can recognize that ranchers are trying to do the right thing, and what they're trying to do is care for the environment, I think we're going to have a better ground to start with collaboration. It's possible that this whole analysis paints much too much of a rosy picture of ranching. And the ranchers were really conscious of that when I went back to them. They really pointed out to me cases of things they called meanness. And that meanness related to things like whether or not your wife could have children or had a kitchen that was up to modern times, or whether really on the razor's edge, they called it, of going over the line. And they talked about overgrazing. They talked about environmental degradation as mistakes. They're not intentional, but something we can learn from, something that we can do. And so it's really important for me to bring that in and say that the ranchers were really not wanting me to just say, like, we do the right thing all the time and we take care of everything. It's much more complex than that. But the ethic of care does provide an alternative framework that's more complex than the adaptive management cycle would imply. Okay, so let's move on to the social ecological system scale. So we want to think about these grasslands and the rangelands that folks are working on and managing, get a better idea of what the actual outcomes are for those ecosystems. There have been a number of frameworks presented, and I think this is the most framework for how adaptation links with the ecological system and ranch management. This is Lavelle et al.'s framework from 2013. It conceptualizes ranches as rangeland social ecological systems. Within that system is an individual adaptive decision by managers that involves individual social values, management goals, and capacity, as well as specific strategies. And then there are ecological outcomes, and there's feedback loops that link between these scales that help us understand the learning of the system. I'm going to add to this a little bit and modify it just slightly with our data from the Northern Mixed Prairie and Shortgrass Steppe. This is a concept from resilience science, which is basically analogizing the social ecological system to something like what a plant community would go through in terms of succession. So it's using an adaptive cycle to interpret social and ecological outcomes. And I think the best metaphor that we could kind of relate to is maybe an old growth forest or a mature rangeland in a conservation stage where there are a few dominant species is a pretty stable state. And then maybe something comes along like a fire or a big disturbance. We'll then reorganize as species come in and colonize and grow and develop, and then it will start to exploit the resources, take off, grow, and really perform. So I'm going to use that to understand the outcomes for the system as a whole. And then, you know, we have these nice boxes and arrows, but this is what rangeland decision making really looks like. I actually got a picture of a decision we made and I was really excited. This rancher's deciding how many cows to sell. And you know, this is where it happens. It's not pretty. So I, you know, use these repeated interviews to get to the management decision-making variables that I use to compare composition. And they're a little bit different than the treatments that we use in experiments. So I'll talk about why that is. But these things, they don't end at the end of the summer. You know, these decisions go on. They go on over long-term time frames, and they go over. They extend across landscape scale in some cases. So we're dealing with, you know, not just a grazing unit at the Central Plains Experimental Range or something. And then here's photo. But I'll also use the data that we collected on 3 plots on each ranch. We actually had the ranchers help us pick out the plot locations. Turned out there was no difference between their subjective perceptions of the rangeland. So we averaged across all the years in the plots. And we're going to try to see if there are any species composition differences on relatively loamy sites across the management variables that seem important to ranchers, but also important to rangeland science. Again, here's the study area, and I want to make an important note about the ranchers that we work with. They're pretty successful, and they're pretty outgoing people. Most of them are pretty educated. They're willing to work with researchers. They know that we're not going to shut them down and that we have good intentions. And I don't have anyone in the study that failed. That's an important caveat because they don't know how that process works. This is a good place to start because you can get an idea for how decision-making processes look. So we're doing well, relatively well. This one has some comments. Okay, so we used repeated interviews to categorize the ranches into planning style, tacit or explicit planning style. 3 levels of grazing strategy, which comes from Roche et al.'s paper in 2015, where she categorized ranchers in Wyoming into 3 grazing strategies. This is the much concern about grazing rotation variable in this study. There are 3 levels of that. Grazing intensity is essentially the number of acres needed to support an animal unit equivalent on that ranch all year, excluding irrigated cropland. And operation type is cow-calf or cow-calf with yearling. And yearlings are calves that stick around. Teenagers. Yesterday. No, they're teenagers. So then we're going to look at, does species composition differ among the management strategies? And then how do we see these ranches changing over time in that adaptive cycle to kind of link to the social and ecological outcomes? So if you're not into statistics, this is all you need to know right now. We saw no difference in species composition between grazing strategies. That's rotational grazing. There was no difference in species composition based on the rotational grazing over the long term on these ranches that had been practicing these approaches for 10 years or longer, some of them for 100 years. Or planning style, tacit or explicit. I have a really complex Excel chart that says where I'm going, or I don't know why I opened the gate and they just went in there and it's fine. No difference. We did see reduced full season perennials on the high intensity ranches and those with yearly. So this is what this looks like. This is an unconstrained ordination. It's a non-metric multidimensional scaling approach where we're trying to see if there's a difference in species composition between these different management strategies. And I can talk a little bit more about how we got this, but basically if these confidence intervals are pancaked on top of each other, we don't think there's a difference between them in terms of species composition. We also are going to account for the environmental variability. We know that rainfall, of course, rainfall, temperature, soil clay, those things really matter a lot to what grows where. Grazing intensity, so what we did here is we did a non-metric multidimensional scaling, and then we rotated an axis to account for the most variation between high and low grazing intensity strategy. And then you ran a linear mixed model on these site scores along that first axis to test for the difference between that, to account for the difference between the grazing intensity management variable and other environmental variables that significantly correlated with this organism. So we do see the high and low groups separating out, and we see more cool season grasses, sedges, perennial forbs, and subshrubs on the low intensity ranches. Pretty similar for operation type, yearlings, cow-calves. This is a pretty well understood phenomenon that stocking rate has a lot to do with species composition change over long periods of time in this ecosystem. It's pretty hard to get at that data. So I think this is kind of exciting. This is a little bit more interesting to me because the yearlings had a similar effect. I think that the yearlings are they're probably better able to restock after a drought faster. They can destock quickly by selling their yearlings, but they might be able to restock faster than cow-calf operators. They're taking their calves and their heifers and building them slower. On average, yearling producers restocked 1 or 2 years after a severe drought in our study. Cow-calf operators describe much longer time periods to restock. So you think of these teenagers out there eating all the good stuff. What did this look like for the ranch system as a whole? And this is kind of a complex slide. I wanted to see where ranches were going, of course, in this adaptive cycle. And we identified folks in each trajectory. There were folks that were sort of in that conservation phase. They were kind of the old growth forests moving along slowly. They weren't making a lot of changes to their management, but they had a lot of potential for system reorganization. They're getting older and more stable. We did actually have 2 folks enter that almost into the release phase during the course of the study, and they were really struggling with what are we going to do next? Who's going to take over? I don't have an heir. What do I do? And they were both taking steps to do something about that, but it was really pretty painful. And I saw a real marked difference in the interviews from one year to the next. One year it was like, you're gonna find me hanging from the gate out here. You know, I'm never leaving. And then the next year it was like, let's really think about the next steps because this is important. Release to reorganization. Folks had just gone through that big process of change. Maybe a new younger person had come in and taken over, or a big drought had reorganized the ranch. These folks were starting up. They were experiencing a lot of rapid change in their management, but there was a lot of potential for relapse. There were a couple of folks that kind of stuck in this cycle. They would get going, and a big winter storm would come in, or they get going and a drought would come in, and it would kind of throw them back. They didn't have a lot of resilience to those big storms. And then the reorganization to exploitation is a pretty common experience, I think, for younger ranchers. They're kind of over the hump, getting a little bit more stable. What they're really doing is learning about their ecology. They're learning what can I do in this system and what can't I do and what infrastructure do I need to eliminate that possible. So I guess this is an idea of sort of how this might relate to the bigger picture. I didn't have the power in the study to test the species composition between these 2 or these 4 categories. I just tested 2 in some of the groups. So I think that might be an interesting thing for us to think about in the future, but just wasn't able to do it with this study. So looking back on that, what lessons we have, and I'll talk about it a little bit more in terms of our theory. This is a really great example of how we can work with ranchers to build our existing knowledge of range land decision-making process on the ground. And they were interested in learning, and they were interested in collaborating with us in the long study. So I'll move on before I get going too much on that. Okay, so the last step, and I don't think we have any stakeholders here today, but this was something I got suckered in. And I'm really glad that I did. Maria needed help taking notes at these meetings that were going on out at the Central Plains Experimental Range, and I couldn't not analyze the data. So it's been really fun. There have been a lot of people involved in the Center for Collaborative Conservation, actually sponsored this chapter. This is the Collaborative Adaptive Rangeland Management Experiment. So it's looking at this structured decision-making process that integrates science and collaboration into rangeland management. And the basic gist of this, is, if you're not into collaborative adaptive management, is that we gave 11 stakeholders coming from government agencies, from government agencies, conservation NGOs, and 4 ranchers. Ranchers get more votes. We put them in a room together. We gave them 440 steers. Half of those are going to be used in a paired comparison study, and half are going to be adaptive to manage. 6,400 acres in 10 years, go. And we're going to throw as much monitoring data as David Augustine can come up with, and way more than anyone could possibly analyze or understand. And my job was to figure out how they made decisions and are they learning. So you can see here that we've got, actually there are 20 pastures here, so there are 10 half-section pastures that are managed in the adaptive component of this process. So these stakeholders meet 3 times a year, and they decide how are we going to decide when to rotate cattle? How are we going to decide what the stocking rate should be? How are we going to decide if we should use any other vegetation treatments like fire? And at the same time, these yellow pastures are managed with a moderate stocking rate, continuous season-long grazing approach that's really common on the Pawnee National Grass. It's kind of what's been practiced for the last 80 years or so, or maybe since the 50s. The group set up goals in 2013 to manage the land in order to pass it on to future generations. So they did this hard stuff before I came on, which was really great. They also set up vegetation, profitable ranching operation, and wildlife goals, and then set specific objectives for specific on this experimental range. So there I was, kind of frantically taking notes. And I wanted to think of a way that we could put it all together into a timeline. So I took all of the qualitative notes from our meetings and I put them together into this kind of tree ring cycle. So it shows you that adaptive management, this is really kind of Lauren's idea, that it spirals. So you don't end up in the same place when you circle in that big green circle. These decisions build on each other and they're path dependent. And they're also constrained by the scientific sideboards of a project like this. And they're constrained by, or maybe they benefit from, the existing knowledge of stakeholders. So you can see here the stakeholders met multiple times, and then these big colored lines are how often the cattle will rotate. So first we had a control year where we collected baseline data, and then the stakeholders experimented with sort of how fast should we rotate and should we burn. And I do want to say that this wasn't just from the meeting notes. We then conducted interviews with folks in March of this year. We took the findings from those interviews and went back to the stakeholder group and we said, this is what we thought you said, is that true? What else do you have to add? So they're really part of this process and they're gonna help me edit this manuscript. I think that's really important that they're involved in that analysis. If we zoom into the rotational grazing decisions, it's pretty hard to see and the point isn't for you to see it. But I just wanna point out that the rotational grazing decisions that the stakeholders made were hard. So we stuck to low-hanging fruit. We stuck to questions that were based on what the stakeholders already had in their management paradigms, which emphasized a lot about how fast we should rotate. It didn't deal very much with how dead should our cattle be. There were also times when the sideboards of the project really constrained the way that we change our management. The question came up multiple times. Well, we think that the density of our animals in this half-section pasture might have an impact on cattle livestock gains on a per head average daily gain basis. But we can't really change that now, can we? We have to wait until the drought. So there are some things that happen in a project like this where stakeholders' existing knowledge might be emphasizing one type of management direction, and the limitations of this formal adaptive management project might be limiting it in a different way. And they intersect in some pretty interesting ways. With fire, we had a really interesting thing happen. In 2014, we burned 25% of 2 pastures. In 2015, our grazing triggers were a little different, and we had plenty of rested pastures. We had 6 rested pastures instead of the 2 we were shooting for, but we decided not to burn. And that was a big deal for this group, to go through this process of realizing that ranchers were going to vote no on the burn, that conservation NGOs were going to vote yes on the burn. The burns are really good for mountain plover habitat. And the agency folks are going to abstain. They don't want to get in the middle. And I think we could have framed this as a conflict. We could have framed this as a problem. But actually, when we talk to people, you know, when I got in the pickup truck with people and I talked to them about it, we're working in a system where conservation NGOs, representatives, many of them have master's degrees or even working on a PhD in wildlife management, human dimensions of natural resources. And they really emphasize heterogeneity in the ecosystem. They emphasize ecosystem processes. They really understand the value of fire in this kind of project. Rangers, on the other hand, have 80-some years of multi-generational experience in a system where it doesn't rain very much. And there isn't always a lot of forage, and you don't know if it's going to rain next year. And burning is going to get rid of some of that forage that you might have stored up. So we have really different perceptions of objectives and really different perceptions of risk. And that was a learning process for us, I think, in the scientific group, to understand how existing systems of knowledge interact with the monitoring data and really frame the decisions that a collaborative group like this is going to go through. So the big take home from this part of the study for me was really that rangeland management knowledge sits in places. People come from specific management contexts, existing understanding of how to manage rangeland. And what collaborative adaptive management is trying to do is create a new context and new information where we can manage together for different goals and objectives than you might do in your work or on your own ranch. And it's going to take longer than 3 years to do that. Participatory research is exciting for these stakeholders, and there's potential for real benefit in their real lives. There's potential that we could take this approach to collaborative management back to the Pawnee National Grasslands, back to other lands managed by the Nature Conservancy, back to our own worlds, and use science to inform management in complex systems. But it's tricky, and we have to find ways to conceptualize that C in adaptive management that accounts for the context of the knowledge we already have. So participatory research can facilitate social learning if we work with existing knowledge systems and expertise. That's really what it is. And we've talked many times about what are we talking about here? Learning. Is this a knowledge system? Is this just information? What is it that you have when you're managing rangelands? And it's expertise. That's what it is. All the animations. Oh, okay. So just to sum it up, what does this all mean? And I know Maria's going to grill me on this later. What does this all mean? Why go through this process of interviewing ranchers, monitoring their pastures? Well, for me, it's been a huge learning experience, obviously. It's been great to have this other committee of ranchers and stakeholders giving me feedback about my experience here in academia. And one actually said this morning, sorry to lead you to the dark side. So I kind of felt that. Hold on, let me send back a bottle. But we think back to that first chapter and that first scale, management for ranchers and what that experience is like. I think it's time for us to move beyond this great divide of wondering whether humans fit into natural systems and wondering whether adaptive management can be systematic enough at the ranch scale. I think we can interpret the ethic of care as an opportunity to collaborate with folks that care about the same things we do here on the dark side or in practice of conservation organization. And I think we need to think about those collaborations and use our research in ways that are going to promote positive transformation in rangeland systems. So we need to learn to talk to each other, and we need to learn where other people are coming from. And that's how we're going to get ranchers to do what we want them to do, or the conservation efforts to really come true. In the second chapter, I talked about range decision-making and the social ecological system scale. And I think what the findings from that chapter tell us is that it's time to move on from the rotational grazing debate, because, I'm not the first person to say this, but because we need more decision-making research on stocking rate. And that's going to be political, that's going to be economic, and that's going to be a really tough conversation for range science. Stocking rate decisions now happen in a globalized context, and it doesn't just mean how many cattle do you have, what kind of cattle do you have, and who are you selling them to, and how are they being consumed. So we need to think more holistically about the broader context of stocking rate decision-making, and I don't think that's been done. There's been a lot of economic modeling, but we haven't gone out and asked ranchers, how do you make it? I think I have some of that data. We need to start thinking about ranch social ecological system resilience, and how are there phases and cycles that ranches go through where we might best interpret their needs for decision-making support, for climate change adaptation, maybe succession planning support, some other things that link across scales that really extend beyond rotational grazing. And for the collaborative adaptive management project, maybe this concept of adaptive management isn't really what we're trying to get at. It's a pretty reductionist concept. There are pretty limited constraints on what it really means. And in this collaborative context, we really need to frame how existing systems of knowledge and expertise really fit into that formal scientific method. I think it's an opportunity for all of us to learn. We can build on existing knowledges and knowledge, and start to have conversations with each other that make a difference, particularly in the context of public lands management. And while I was writing all of this, there was a lot going on in the news. There were a lot of text messages and a lot of Facebook posts coming out of Oregon and other places where folks who were presenting themselves as ranchers were really doing it the other way. And I think collaboration is an approach that means a lot to people who really depend on these rangeland systems, and people who care about the wildlife and the vegetation. So we need to think about other alternatives to that conflict, and this is one. And this is important to me too, because social scientists are really deconstructive, right? That's what we do. We just take your idea and we deconstruct it, and we say, oh, there are these holes in your idea. And it took me a long time to be mature enough to say that this approach is actually something I want to think about whether I invest an early part of my career in this collaborative process. So to summarize, cattle ranching on the central Great Plains is rangeland management, and rangeland management is adaptive management. Just need to think a little bit differently about how we're using these words. So thanks to everyone who helped out with data collection, data analysis, keeping Hailey alive, but I do especially want to thank the funders. The Center for Collaborative Conservation has actually been involved with this project since 2012 when Emily Kajargis was the postdoc who started it. So this project is made up entirely of leftovers and scientific rumors. The AFA grant and the Colorado Egg Experiment Station project also supported my work, as did the USDA ARS. It's a little hinky, I know, but yes. Sure. So for folks who can't hear, David Augustine's asking, I think, what's the value of the depth of doing repeated interviews with a smaller group of people, maybe 6 for the first chapter, that you can't get from the broader surveys, which are typically used to understand the factors that relate to prediction, relate to adoption of an innovation or specific management practices, and why go about doing that. I think there's a couple levels of that. One is The repeated interviews are really important because I think people started to trust me a little bit more and admit things they wouldn't have admitted earlier, like how much they use the internet or whether they'd subdivided 10 acres that they didn't want to tell me about earlier. So there's always this question in social research: are people filling out the survey the way that they want me to? Am I presenting myself as something other than what I really do? And by doing repeated in-depth interviews where you come back and say, is this what you said? Is it true? You're able to kind of get to the truth of it. And I think people were willing to tell me, over a period of time, they kind of got sick of me coming to their kitchen table, and they started to sort of tell me the truth of it, just to get me out of there. I think it's really important to do the qualitative analysis because it gives us an idea of the experience for people. So it's not just what are they doing, but what does it mean to them? This is their livelihoods, and that's not money. That's something that they are. So it allows us to see a little bit more depth. And the last thing is it helps us build theory. So one of the problems specifically with these repeated surveys that everybody is doing with every single practice that they want ranchers to do, guess what? They find that there is no average rancher, right? The soils, the climate, the social system that I'm living in, the product that I'm producing, they're all really different. It's the same reason the Green Revolution failed in Africa. It's a very complex system. And so when we average across these large groups of ranchers, maybe we see some really important things. And actually those surveys explain a low level of the variance in terms of conservation adoption anyways. So we keep doing these because we haven't modified our theory. We need to develop better theories that incorporate some of the other things we know from different scales. And Lubell tried to do that, I think, really well, engaging with all these really different theories from social psychology to ecology. So that'd be neat to look at. Yeah.
I would make sense.
Oh, cool. Yeah.
This is building off of, we were just sitting up here. The first question is if you're
Yeah, that's a really good question. Yeah, so a lot of different scales. We had some folks that had been managing for 100 years on 58,000 acres, and we had some people that had been managing since 1960, and they were down to 1,000 acres. At one point, they'd been much larger. So I think that's a really good point. That I haven't seen that in the literature, actually, and I think that's because we tend to generalize when we talk about farmers or ranchers. We have an image of them. They dress a certain way. They're white, male, and over 65, right? And it's actually a much more complex system than that. And ecologically, we know it's a much more complex system than that. So yeah, I think what we need to do is train our extension agents, and I'm saying that because I'm trained in extension as well. We need to think about diversity in many different ways. We need to think about diversity in terms of agroecological approach, market approach, gender, race, ethnicity. We need to start having these conversations, and there's lots of literature on how our inability to see people who don't look like us really frames the way extension services get provided. And so that concept of who's authentic or worth my time is important. Yeah. Yeah, so you're going to have a bigger impact if you can get to the big guy in terms of ecology, and that's really important. Yeah, but it takes a village, right? So, yeah. Yeah, maybe one of those kids that grew up on those, little 40-acre tracts will grow up to, really make a difference. So who knows?
So one of the applications we're reaching, maybe not farmers, but middle guys.
Yeah, and that's one of the ways that we need to readjust our theory. So we are assuming that the big guys are going to help the little guys, right? And they might not be there because we haven't focused on them, and that's part of the discussion. Yeah. In Eastern Colorado, on the Pawnee, they're still there. Yeah, and what does it mean for young farmers and ranchers? What does that mean for the next generation? For me, that means being embedded and being in place and saying, you know, rather than flying all over, I'm going to stick in one place until I get to know people and find out what that diversity is. But those are probably the folks that are having the most impact on the rangeland. I mean, there's examples right across the fence, right? You know, where breathing exists. It's a real thing. So, I don't know if I answered your question. I don't know if there's an answer. Yeah, Rita?
This time you're private school.
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah, and we've just been thinking about that. It's really important for us to share literature. One thing that was really useful is just learning theory, and so Dr. Turk and I have shared papers on, you know, what does teaching look like, what's good practice, what is the research, and I think that's applicable to everyone because even if you're a scientist that doesn't work with collaborative stakeholders, you might be mentoring grad students. So learning what we know currently about learning theory is really important. And Novak's work at Cornell with the mind maps was really foundational to all of this because that discussion of mind maps has happened in ecology. And so it's a good place to start out because people have kind of an idea that there might be different mind maps of how these systems work. And we tried that with our collaborative group. We tried some mind mapping. They didn't like it, but actually those results were really helpful for me. So it was painful for them, but it was really great how they mapped things out. Yeah, Andy?
Did you find visiting ranches, what percentage is wanting to work with the services people and the outside people? It's becoming more common now than it was.
I think, well, I don't know. I might have ruined that for the next group of grad students, but yes. I mean, more and more people are calling ranchers, and I went out, you know, to Eastern Colorado, and I think they're the next hot thing for anthropologists. Studied everything else. So, so I don't know if it matters. I think we're going to be knocking on your door. No, I think, you know, when I first started this project, there were 3 or 4 people on the west side that responded, and there was 2 people on the east side that responded, and one I just basically guilted into it. So I don't know, on the east side, I think it depends on the community, and it depends on the relationships that folks have, and it speaks to the value of the work that the Serial Raising ARS has done forever, and maintain those relationships over the long term. So,
well, I know, like, years ago, you know, rancher would talk to a bird person, and bird person would talk to the rancher, and, you know, I just wondered if it's becoming more groups working together now.
what do you think, Craig? Like, are you? I'm just teasing Craig. I think the next generation, you know, we're really interconnected. We're always on our phones. We're always talking, and we see other ideas that aren't ours all the time on the internet. So I think it's going to open up, but I think it also has to open up, right? I think that's one of the things our ranchers told us in the interviews is we have to find a way to collaborate. If this doesn't work, we won't be here. So I don't feel the cool. Does anyone on the phone have anything? Can't really see you. Okay.
Thank you.